Frances Otley is standing very still in the middle of a borrowed dressing room on Chester Street, just off Eaton Square, and the early afternoon light coming through the tall window behind her is doing exactly what her aunt's dressmaker promised it would do at the final fitting, catching the white duchesse satin of her skirt and turning it the pale, faintly luminous color of the inside of a shell. It is the last week of June in 1887. The summer London has already started calling the Golden Jubilee season, and Frances has been standing in one dressed state or another for close to 2 hours. Her maid, girl named Sarah, borrowed from her aunt's own household for the occasion, is on her knees behind her, easing the last folds of a 3-yard velvet train into a soft loop over Frances's left forearm, because a train that long cannot simply trail behind a young woman on a London pavement. The way a person manages any object heavier and more unwieldy than it looks. 3 white ostrich feathers rise from the crown of her head, arranged in the particular fan the court now calls the Prince of Wales plume. The centre feather standing a little higher than the 2 beside it, and beneath them a veil of white tulle falls to her shoulders, pinned so carefully into her upswept hair that Sarah has already stuck herself twice trying to anchor it against any possible movement of Frances's head. Her gloves are new and reach well past the elbow, kid leather so pale it is nearly the same white as the gown, and underneath all of it, unseen and unmentioned, a corset laced since 10 o'clock this morning holds her ribs in a shape they do not naturally make, the whalebone pressing a faint private ache into her sides with every breath she takes. A single strand of her late mother's pearls sits at her throat, the one piece of jewelry in the room that belongs to her outright and was not borrowed, rented, or purchased new for this single, enormously expensive afternoon. Her aunt, Lady Maud Pelham, stands a few feet away in a plum-colored gown of her own, watching the whole arrangement with the practiced, unhurried eye of a woman who was presented at this same palace herself 26 years earlier, and has never entirely forgotten. She reaches out once to adjust the angle of the center feather by perhaps ½ an inch, steps back and studies her niece the way a portrait painter studies a canvas before deciding it is finished. Frances looks, by any measure the room can offer, flawless. She looks composed in the specific costly way a family wants its daughter to look when that daughter is about to be looked at by the only woman in England whose opinion of her, formed in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, could shape the rest of her life. She looks, in her aunt's private and relieved estimation, exactly like a young woman who belongs in that palace, whatever her father's bank balance might quietly suggest to the contrary. And underneath all of that white satin, underneath the feathers pinned so precisely into her hair, and the pearls at her throat, and the gloves holding her own hands, still Frances Otley is a frightened 18-year-old girl who has not eaten anything since 7 o'clock this morning, will not eat or drink again until well into the evening, and is about to spend an unknown number of hours standing, walking, and finally curtsying her way through one of the most physically punishing rituals the British aristocracy has ever built for its own daughters. A ritual so exhausting and so exacting that grown women twice her age have been known to faint dead away in the middle of it. Not the guards, not the footmen, not even the lady standing directly beside them is permitted to catch them when they fall. The story of what is about to happen to her in the hours between this quiet dressing room and the moment she finally sits back down in her father's rented carriage is a great deal more complicated, more physically brutal, and more human than any painting of a Golden Jubilee debutante will ever let you see. This is London, 1887. Queen Victoria has now sat on the throne for 50 years, and the whole country has spent the summer marking it with parades and Thanksgiving services, and a newly minted Jubilee sixpence jingling in half the pockets in the capital. For the daughters of Britain's aristocracy and its increasingly wealthy upper middle class, The Golden Jubilee season carries a particular weight, because to be presented at court in this specific year is to be presented to a queen at the very peak of her public significance, in front of a season more crowded, more competitive, and more closely watched than almost any other in living memory. Every young woman filing into Buckingham Palace over these summer weeks is taking part in a ritual that the culture around her has agreed, almost without discussion, to treat as pure glamour, a fairy tale afternoon of silk and feathers and royal favor. What that same culture has quietly agreed never to examine too closely is the physical toll the ritual actually exacts on ordinary young bodies in ordinary and entirely predictable ways. This video is that examination, not a costume drama about a beautiful dress and a fairy tale curtsy. An honest physical account of what a court presentation actually demanded of the young women who underwent it, from the weeks of preparation beforehand to the hours of standing without food, water, or a place to sit, to the precise unnatural choreography required to back out of a royal presence without ever turning away from it, to the brutal social machinery waiting on the other side for any girl who got even a single detail wrong. We are going to spend real time with the corset and the fainting and the 6-hour carriage queue and the merciless gossip of the London season, because those details, and not the finished portrait, are where the actual history lives. Before we go any further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you would rather sit with the real version of the past than the flattering one the portraits preferred, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps a small channel keep doing this particular kind of work. And if you would like to, leave a word in the comments about which era of history you find most fascinating to sit with. I read every one of them. Let us begin then, not with the palace itself, which is still hours away, but with the young woman standing in this dressing room, and the particular, complicated body she has spent 18 years learning to present. Frances Otley was born in 1869 on her family's land in Warwickshire, at a house called Hartwell Grange her father's family had held, with varying fortunes, for nearly 2 centuries. Colonel Edmund Otley, her father, spent the better part of 2 decades as an officer in India, before returning home to manage an estate that had, by the time Frances was old enough to notice such things, stopped quietly making money and started quietly losing it. The reasons had nothing to do with anything the Otleys had done wrong, and everything to do with a change in the world around them, a flood of cheap grain arriving from American farms across an ocean that steamships and railways had made, for the first time in history, close enough to compete directly with English wheat. Agricultural economists and historians of rural England have documented the collapse in painstaking detail. Rents on arable land falling by 1/3 or more across broad stretches of the country between the 1872 and the late 1880s. Tenant farmers unable to pay what they had once paid without complaint, and landowning families like the Otleys watching an income that had supported 3 generations quietly shrink to something considerably less comfortable. Frances grew up understanding, in the particular, unspoken way, children absorb their family's true financial position long before anyone explains it to them directly, that Hartwell Grange looked exactly as prosperous as it had always looked, and was, underneath that appearance, not prosperous at all. Physically, she is not the willowy, faintly ethereal figure so many portraits of the period like to suggest a young lady ought to be. She is of middling height, sturdily built, with the kind of constitution built by actual outdoor exercise, rather than careful indoor idleness. A legacy of a childhood spent riding across her father's fields, with an ease she has never entirely learned to disguise in London drawing rooms, where a certain fashionable delicacy is still, in 1887, considered more becoming than good health. Her face is generally described by her family as sensible rather than beautiful, a word Frances has heard often enough to have made her private peace with it. She has, since her mother's death from typhoid 4 years earlier, been raised largely under the supervision of her aunt, Lady Maud Pelham, her mother's older sister, married to a baronet with a comfortable London house, and critically for Frances's prospects, which, under the rules of the Lord Chamberlain's office, makes her the only relative available to sponsor Frances into society at all. A young woman could not simply present herself at court. She required a lady who had herself already been presented, and without her aunt's willingness to take on that role and to underwrite a considerable portion of its expense, Frances would not be standing in this dressing room today. Colonel Otley himself had travelled up to London with his daughter and sister-in-law at the start of the season, though he would not attend the drawing room itself, since a father's presence at his own daughter's court presentation was neither expected nor in most cases permitted under the ceremony's own arrangement. He had spent the days since their arrival largely occupied with his own business at his club and with correspondence to his estate agent back in Warwickshire, and had said remarkably little to Frances directly about the season's actual purpose beyond a single, gruff conversation on the train journey down, in which he had told her, without unkindness, but without much softening either, that he trusted her to do credit to the family name, and that he was placing a great deal of confidence in her aunt's judgment on every particular he did not personally understand. Frances had found the conversation more unsettling than any direct instruction could have been, precisely because her father so rarely spoke to her about anything beyond the estate and its finances, and his sudden, formal seriousness on this one subject told her, more clearly than any lecture could have, exactly how much he believed rode on the coming weeks. What is being asked of her this particular afternoon, and across this entire season, is a specific and exhausting kind of performance. She must appear serene, poised, and entirely untroubled by nerves in front of the one woman in the country whose brief, formal notice of her could shape which drawing rooms open to her for the rest of her life. She must carry, without visible effort, a train and headdress and set of undergarments that together weigh more than anything she has ever worn on horseback. She must do all of this while her father's finances, though never spoken of aloud in front of her, sit quietly behind every decision her aunt has made about which dressmaker to use and which gown to order, because a marriage made well this season could restore a family's fortunes in a single stroke, and a season that produced nothing could not easily be repeated. Frances has a private habit, one she has never mentioned to her aunt or to anyone else, of silently reciting the names of the fields at Hartwell Grange when she is frightened. The Long Meadow, the Barley Close, the Ridings, the name of every field on her father's land in the order she learned to ride across them as a child. And she has been doing exactly this, under her breath and behind a perfectly composed face for most of the last 2 hours. The carriage will be at the door within the half hour, her aunt has just informed her, and once Frances steps into her court dress for the final adjustment of her train, there will be no sitting down again in any ordinary sense, no eating, no drinking, and very little that resembles comfort, until this single, decisive afternoon is finally, completely over. Sarah began working on Frances's hair at 8:30 this morning, nearly 4 hours before the carriage was due. And if you picture the hairdressing of a Victorian debutante at all, you probably picture something quick and decorative, a few practiced twists of already clean, finished in perhaps 20 minutes by a woman who does this every day. It is a comfortable picture, borrowed largely from paintings that show only the result, and it has almost nothing to do with what actually happened in this dressing room over the course of the morning. The actual reality is that Frances's hair had not been properly washed in close to 3 weeks, and this was not neglect on Sarah's part or carelessness on Frances's own. Ruth Goodman, whose years of living history experiments reconstructing ordinary Victorian domestic routines have done more than almost any single scholar to correct modern assumptions about 19th century hygiene, has documented how rarely most Victorian women of any class washed their hair outright, often no more than once a month. Because the era's soaps stripped natural oils so aggressively, and drying long hair without modern heat took so many hours that frequent washing was considered both impractical and faintly unhealthy. What women did instead, daily or near daily, was brush their hair with real vigor, sometimes 100 strokes or more, working a scalp's natural oils down along the length of the hair to give it shine, and treat any residual dullness with a small dab of pomade. A scented mixture of fat and wax that a lady's maid worked carefully through the ends and along the crown. For an occasion as significant as a court presentation, the pomade was applied more heavily than usual, specifically to help the elaborate upswept style hold its shape under the considerable weight it was about to carry. That weight was the real engineering problem of the morning. The fashionable style of 1887 called for hair swept high and back from the face in a mass of curls and coils, a silhouette few women could achieve using only their own natural hair, however long it had grown. Sarah, like most ladies' maids serving a family of the Otley's position, had been trained to work false hair, small pads of combed human hair called rats, into the crown and sides to build volume and height without adding a nearly universal practice of the period, that period etiquette manuals discussed as openly and unremarkably as a modern hairdresser might discuss extensions. Onto this constructed foundation, anchored by dozens of hairpins driven directly into both the natural hair and the hidden padding beneath it, the 3 ostrich feathers and their tulle veil then had to be pinned securely enough to survive several hours of standing walking, and one considerable carriage ride over London's cobbled streets without so much as tilting. Queen Victoria herself was known to dislike a drooping or undersized plume intensely, and word had circulated through fashionable London years earlier that Her Majesty wished to see the feathers held well up and clearly visible as a presentee approached her, which meant that no lady's maid worth her wages would risk anchoring them loosely. For Frances, the morning meant close to 2 hours seated at a dressing table while Sarah worked, her scalp growing steadily tighter under the accumulating pins, a dull, specific ache building at the crown of her head that had nothing romantic about it and everything to do with several ounces of false hair, feather quill, and wire framework being secured, pin by pin, directly into her own skull. She sat as still as she could manage because any sudden movement risked undoing an hour of careful work, and passed the time reciting, silently and without moving her lips, the names of the fields at Hartwell Grange, a habit that had nothing to do with hair and everything to do with the particular kind of fear. Families further down the financial ladder than the Otleys, unable to afford even a modest lady's maid, often relied on the fashionable hairdressing establishments of Mayfair and Bond Street, which on drawing-room mornings were booked from before dawn, their appointment books crowded for weeks in advance during a busy season, particularly one as crowded as the Golden Jubilee summer of 1887, when far more families than usual wanted their daughters presented in this specific, historically significant year. A single professional dressing of hair and headdress for a court presentation could cost a guinea or more, a considerable sum for a household already straining to afford the gown, the gloves, the carriage hire, and the fee that traditionally accompanied a sponsor's letter to the Lord Chamberlain's office. The performance, once finished, looked effortless. The machinery behind it, in Frances's dressing room and in every hairdresser's chair in Mayfair that same morning, was considerably less so. There is something worth noticing in the fact that Frances would spend the rest of this day being admired for a head of hair that was by any honest description largely constructed, padded, pinned, and pomaded into a shape her own hair could never have held on its own. By long and comfortable custom, never to mention it. Now the weeks that led up to this particular morning, because the hair and the gown were only the visible portion of a much longer and more anxious campaign that had begun for the Otley family a full 3 months earlier, the moment Lady Pelham sat down to write her letter of sponsorship to the Lord Chamberlain's office. A young woman in 1887 could not simply decide to be presented at court and appear at the palace gates. The system operated through a formal chain of permission that began with a sponsor, always a lady who had herself already been presented, submitting a request naming her presentee and vouching, in effect, for the family's respectability and social standing. Lady Pelham's letter, drafted with real care over the course of an evening at Hartwell Grange the previous spring, named Francis, formally confirmed Lady Pelham's own presentation some 26 years earlier as the qualifying credential, and requested a place at one of the summer's drawing rooms specifically. Since the demand for the Jubilee season's expanded calendar of presentations was already by that point considerably heavier than usual. The office's confirmation, when it finally arrived some weeks later, specified the date, the general hour by which the family's carriage was expected to join the queue, and a formal reminder of the regulation dress requirements. A document Lady Pelham kept afterward among her own private papers as carefully as she had kept the equivalent letter from her own presentation decades before. Lady Colin Campbell's widely read etiquette manual, Manners and Rules of Good Society, first published in the years just before Francis's own presentation and revised repeatedly through the following decades, laid out the entire process in exacting detail, advising families that a debutante and her sponsor together needed a full 3 weeks of advanced preparation once a presentation date was confirmed, both to secure the correctly regulated gown and to master what the manual called, without any apparent irony. 3 weeks does not sound like a long apprenticeship for a single beau until you understand what that beau actually required a young woman's body to do while wearing several pounds of silk, whalebone, and ostrich feather. A subject this video will return to in careful detail once Francis reaches the palace itself. For the Otleys, those 3 months carried a financial weight that Francis understood only in general outline, since her father and aunt discussed the actual figures well out of her hearing. A properly regulated court gown, cut to the precise specifications the Lord Chamberlain's office required, a low bodice, short sleeves, regardless of the weather, and a train no less than 3 yards in length from the shoulder and no less than 54 inches wide at its furthest edge, did not come cheaply from any dressmaker capable of producing work that would not embarrass a sponsoring family in front of the entire assembled court. Add to that the ostrich feathers themselves, sold at a premium during any season and at something closer to a scarcity price during a Jubilee summer, when every fashionable milliner in London was fielding orders from families desperate to be presented in this particular historic year. The white kid gloves. The hire of a suitable carriage for a family that did not keep one of its own in town, and the customary fee that accompanied a sponsor's letter, and the total cost of a single afternoon's presentation could run to a sum not far short of a farm labourer's entire annual wage. Colonel Otley had, in the end, sold a small parcel of outlying land at Hartwell Grange to cover his share of it. A fact Francis had not been told directly, but had pieced together in the particular, unspoken way she pieced together most of her family's true circumstances, from a conversation half overheard through a closed study door. She had practiced the curtsy itself most evenings for nearly a month by then, in the drawing room at Hartwell Grange, before the family ever came up to London, with a length of old curtain pinned to her shoulders, in place of the train she did not yet own. Sinking down under her aunt's watchful correction again and again until her knees ached and her aunt finally grudgingly pronounced the depth and the recovery acceptable. It had felt, most evenings, less like learning a courtesy and more like training for an athletic event whose rules made no allowance for how her own body actually moved, and in a very real sense, that is exactly what it was. There is a particular kind of quiet exhaustion in spending 3 months, and in the Otley's case, a portion of the family's already diminished land, preparing for a single afternoon whose entire purpose was to look, to everyone watching, as though it had cost nothing at all. Which brings us to the question nobody in that dressing room said aloud, but everyone in it had been quietly managing since 10 o'clock that morning. What was actually holding Frances's shape underneath all that white satin, and what was it costing her to wear it? If you picture a Victorian corset at all, you probably picture the caricature version, a garment laced with cruel, deliberate force down to some impossible 17 or 18-inch waist, worn by women who fainted regularly and considered the fainting itself a mark of refinement. It is a vivid picture, and it owes more to satirical cartoons and a handful of extreme, well-publicized cases than it does to the ordinary experience of most Victorian women, a point the fashion historian Valerie Steele has argued at length in her research into the genuine, surviving garments of the period, many of which measure a good deal larger, the waist, than popular memory assumes, and show wear patterns consistent with moderate, not extreme, lacing. The actual reality, for a young woman like Frances, on a day like this one, sat somewhere between the caricature and the comfortable, modern dismissal of it. Her everyday corset, the one she wore for riding in ordinary country life at Hartwell Grange, was laced for support and a reasonably fashionable line rather than for maximum constriction, since a young woman who spent her mornings on horseback needed lungs that actually worked. The corset Sarah had laced her into at 10 o'clock this morning was a different garment entirely, cut with a longer steel busk at the front to enforce the very erect straight-back posture the court etiquette explicitly required of a presentee, and laced, at her aunt's specific instruction, a full 2 inches tighter than Frances wore day to day. Because a slouching or visibly relaxed spine in front of the Queen is considered, by the standards Lady Colin Campbell's etiquette manual laid out in careful detail, a genuine social failure, rather than a minor lapse. Beneath that corset sat a linen chemise, and over it a corset cover, several starched petticoats, and holding the fashionable silhouette of 1887 at the back, rather than the sides, a wire and steel bustle frame, the elaborate rearward shelf that the fashion of this particular decade demanded, onto which the full weight of the train would shortly be gathered and pinned. Taken together, the whalebone, the steel busk, the bustle frame, and the layered petticoats added up to a garment system that pressed steadily inward on Frances's ribs and diaphragm every time she inhaled. A physical fact that a handful of physicians writing in journals such as the British Medical Journal had been documenting and quietly worrying over for decades, describing reduced lung capacity, displaced organs in extreme cases, and a measurable strain on the body's ability to take a genuinely full breath. For Frances, the difference between her ordinary corset and this one made itself known within the first hour of wearing it. A persistent low pressure at her lower ribs whenever she breathed deeply, and a faint lightheadedness whenever she turned her head too quickly that she attributed, reasonably enough, to the tightness of the lacing, rather than to any particular fear about the afternoon ahead. She had said as much to her aunt once, tentatively an hour into the dressing, and had been told, not unkindly, but without any real room for negotiation, that a properly laced back was simply the price of standing correctly in front of the Queen, and that women twice her age managed it every single drawing room without complaint. Frances did not mention it again. She had learned, over the past several months of preparation, exactly which discomforts were worth voicing to her aunt and which were simply part of the arrangement. The way sitting quietly through an uncomfortable church sermon was part of the arrangement, something to be endured rather than discussed. The broader context here matters, because the burden of this particular garment system fell unevenly across the social ranks, filing into Buckingham Palace that same summer. A family with real wealth could commission a corset built to measure by an experienced court dressmaker, cut to fit its wearer's actual body with enough skill that even a tightly laced garment distributed its pressure reasonably well across the ribs. A family further down the ladder, stretching to afford the season at all, often made do with a ready-made corset, adjusted as best a local dressmaker or the young woman's own maid could manage, a garment considerably more likely to pinch, chafe, or press unevenly in exactly the spots where a well-fitted one would not. Ruth Goodman's own experiments wearing reconstructed Victorian foundation garments across long working days have described this difference bluntly, noting how dramatically a corset's actual comfort depends on the skill and expense that went into fitting it. A detailed period portraits, which show only the finished silhouette. Frances's corset, purchased at real but manageable expense through her aunt's own dressmaker, sat somewhere in the comfortable middle of that range, tight enough to ache and loose enough not to truly endanger her, which made her in the specific arithmetic of Golden Jubilee court dress one of the more fortunate young women dressing in London that particular morning. The question of exactly how dangerous ordinary Victorian corsetry actually was has itself become a small ongoing argument among historians, and it is worth naming, honestly, rather than settling on whichever version happens to be more dramatic. The popular 19th century press occasionally ran alarming stories of young women whose ribs had been permanently reshaped or whose internal organs had supposedly shifted position from years of tight lacing. And the British Medical Journal published genuine physician correspondence raising real concerns about restricted breathing and weakened back muscles among women who laced tightly for years on end. Valerie Steele's later research complicates this picture considerably, showing that the surviving corsets in museum collections vary enormously in how tightly they were actually worn, and that a great many Victorian women, most of the time, laced for a fashionable loin and a supported back rather than for the extreme waist-crushing tightness the caricature suggests. Both things were true at once. Ordinary daily corsetry for most women was uncomfortable but survivable, while occasional, deliberately extreme lacing, of exactly the kind Lady Pelham was asking of Frances for one specific and unusually demanding afternoon, could and did produce the shortness of breath, the lightheadedness, and the increased likelihood of fainting that this video will return to shortly. Once Frances actually reaches the crowded, overheated rooms of the palace itself, there is something clarifying in understanding that the very posture everyone in that dressing room found so becoming, the straight spine, the composed stillness, the effortless-looking uprightness, Frances was already being praised for before she had even left the house. It was an engineered one, built from steel and whalebone, and 2 extra inches of lacing that nobody in the room, least of all Frances herself, felt any particular need to mention out loud. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what 3 additional yards of heavy silk velvet sewn into a single garment and attached at the shoulder would actually feel like dragging behind an 18-year-old girl who has never worn anything like it in her life. If you picture a court train at all, you probably picture something weightless and cinematic, a long, graceful sweep of fabric that seems to float behind its wearer, the way it does in a formal portrait, drifting into place with no more effort than a curtain stirring in a draught. It is a beautiful image, and it depends entirely on the viewer never having to actually lift the thing. The actual reality laid out with precision in the Lord Chamberlain's own regulations and repeated faithfully in Manners and Rules of Good Society specified that a lady's court train had to measure no less than 3 yards in length from the shoulder and no less than 54 inches in width at its furthest edge. Sewn from a fabric substantial enough to hold its shape as it spread across the floor of the throne room rather than crumpling limply behind its wearer. For a family with real means, that fabric was typically a heavy silk velvet or a richly worked satin, often embroidered along its edge with silver thread, seed pearls, or a trim of ostrich feather to match the headdress. Embellishment that added, quite literally, pounds of additional weight to a garment already substantial enough on its own. Frances's train, a deep ivory duchesse satin, lined with a stiffened interfacing to help it hold its spread, had been fitted with a discreet loop of ribbon sewn near its midpoint, specifically so that she could gather it up over one arm while walking anywhere, except the final few steps into the Queen's own presence. A practical solution to an entirely impractical garment that every court dressmaker in London had, by 1887, learned to build into every train they made. The dressmaking establishments that produced these gowns had, by the 1882nd, developed something close to a specialized branch of the trade devoted entirely to court dress, distinct from the ordinary ball gowns and day dresses that occupied the rest of their working year. A house with a strong reputation for court work understood, in ways an ordinary dressmaker might not, exactly how a given weight of velvet would behave once spread across a polished floor, exactly where additional boning needed to sit inside the bodice to keep the whole structure upright under the pull of 3 yards of trailing fabric, and exactly how much fabric to allow for the discreet carrying loop that let a young woman manage the train herself for every part of the ceremony except its most critical seconds. Families who could secure an appointment with one of these established court dressmakers, rather than an ordinary local seamstress attempting the specialized garment for the first time, generally ended the day with a train considerably easier to manage. One more small advantage that, like so much else in this story, quietly tracked a family's existing wealth and social connections, rather than any young woman's own individual skill. Managing that weight was itself a skill nobody was born already possessing. Frances had practiced walking the length of the drawing room at Hartwell Grange with a curtain of comparable weight pinned to her shoulders for the better part of a month before ever seeing her actual gown, learning to judge by feel alone. 2. How far behind her the fabric had spread, and how sharply she could turn without either treading on it herself or dragging it into a piece of furniture. A lesson made considerably harder by the bustle frame at her lower back, which projected the whole structure outward in a way that changed, subtly but measurably, how far she needed to hold herself from any wall, doorway, or fellow guest. A single misjudged step, treading on the hem of one's own train while walking forward, was a common enough hazard that every etiquette manual of the period addressed it directly, and a far more serious version of exactly the same hazard was waiting for her later that afternoon. In a moment, this video will return to once Frances reaches the throne room itself. The broader picture here says something specific about how court fashion actually worked as a system of visible expense. A train's exact length was fixed by regulation for every presentee, regardless of rank, so that measurement alone could not distinguish a duke's daughter from a country solicitor's. But the fabric, the embellishment, and the sheer quality of the needlework spread across those 3 regulation yards. To anyone in the room who knew how to read it, almost exactly how much money a family had spent to be standing there. The society press of the day, publications such as The Queen, which reported the details of court dress with the same devoted specificity a modern publication might apply to a red carpet, printed detailed descriptions of the most admired gowns from each drawing room, naming fabrics, trimmings, and occasionally turning the whole afternoon into a public ledger of exactly whose family could and could not afford real Brussels lace over their satin. Frances's gown, respectable but comparatively restrained in its trimming, told anyone reading that ledger closely exactly what her aunt already knew, and Frances herself was only beginning to understand that the Otleys were spending everything they reasonably could on this single afternoon, and not 1 shilling more than that. The train looked, in every sense the room could measure, like pure unearned elegance, 3 yards of ivory satin drifting effortlessly behind a well-born young woman on the most important afternoon of her life. What it actually was, underneath that appearance, was a carefully regulated, expensively embellished, physically demanding piece of engineering that Frances had spent a full month learning to operate, and would spend the rest of this particular afternoon continuing to operate under conditions considerably less forgiving than her family's own drawing room. The carriage, when it finally came, did not carry Frances swiftly anywhere. If you picture the arrival of a Golden Jubilee debutante at all, you probably picture something brisk and cinematic, a smart carriage rolling directly up to the palace gates, a footman opening the door within seconds, and a young woman stepping gracefully down into the afternoon sun with barely a moment lost between her own front door. It is the version every illustrated newspaper of the period preferred to draw, because it made for a handsome engraving, and it bears almost no resemblance to what actually happened to most families on a drawing room afternoon. The actual reality was a queue and not a brief one. Because a single drawing room could involve the formal presentation of several hundred young women in a single afternoon, every family attending had to arrive within a fairly narrow window before the ceremony began, which meant that hundreds of carriages converged on the approaches to Buckingham Palace, funneling down the Mall and around the edges of St. James's Park in a line that barely moved for hour after hour. Families who left their London houses at midday might not reach the palace gates until well into the afternoon, sitting the entire time inside a closed carriage never designed to comfortably hold an occupant, wearing a headdress that could not be tilted, a train that could not be crushed, and a corset that made leaning back against the seat cushion for any length of time a thoroughly unpleasant proposition. Contemporary accounts of the season regularly described these carriage queues stretching for a considerable distance, and the satirical press of the period, Punch chief among them, found the resulting traffic jam of the aristocracy a reliable and recurring joke. A whole city's worth of wealth and rank reduced to sitting motionless in a public thoroughfare for the better part of an afternoon. For Frances, that afternoon meant close to 2 hours inside a hired carriage that grew steadily warmer as the June sun climbed, unable to open the window more than a crack without risking the careful architecture of her hair, unable to lean back without crushing the delicate arrangement of her train where it lay, folded across the seat beside her, and entirely unable to eat, drink, or attend to any ordinary bodily need, because a young woman fully dressed in regulation court costume, laced, pinned, and gloved to the elbow, simply could not manage any of those things without undoing hours of careful preparation. And there was, in any case, nowhere along the Mall to do so, even if she could. She had eaten a very small breakfast at 7 that morning, specifically with this stretch of the day in mind, on her aunt's explicit advice, and by the second hour of the carriage queue, she was genuinely hungry and thirsty, and beginning to feel the particular swimming lightheadedness that comes from sitting upright in a tightly laced corset, done moving carriage for far longer than her body had ever been asked to manage it before. What made the wait feel considerably worse than mere boredom was the audience. Crowds of ordinary Londoners gathered along the carriage route on every drawing room afternoon, and gathered in especially large numbers during the Jubilee summer, standing along the park railings and pressing close enough to carriage windows to peer directly in at the occupants, commenting freely on a young woman's gown, her feathers, her complexion, and her apparent nerves, entirely for their own entertainment, and with no expectation of ever being introduced to her. It was in its own way an entirely public spectacle, built around people who had not chosen to be watched, An afternoon in which a girl like Frances sat trapped and immobile, in full view of strangers who felt no particular need to look away. She kept her eyes fixed for most of the 2 hours on a middle distance point, just past her own carriage window, the way she had noticed her aunt doing at the very start of the queue, and understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that this too was a skill she was expected to have already learned. Street sellers worked the length of that stalled queue with real commercial enthusiasm, moving between the rows of carriages hawking cheap printed programs that claimed, with varying degrees of accuracy, to list the names and families of the more notable young women expected at that afternoon's drawing room, alongside oranges, and penny broadsheets covering the general excitement of the Jubilee summer. Mounted police worked the same crowded stretch of road from the opposite direction, attempting to keep some semblance of order among both the queued carriages and the pedestrians pressing in against the park railings for a closer look. Task contemporary newspaper accounts describe as only partially successful on the busiest drawing room afternoons of the season. Frances' own carriage passed close enough to one particularly persistent group of spectators that she could hear, quite distinctly through the narrow gap of an open window, a woman loudly informing her companions of an entirely invented guess at Frances's own family name, a small specific reminder that the young women inside these carriages had become, for the length of one afternoon, a form of free public entertainment for a city that had not asked their permission and did not particularly require it. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this entire punishing wait, the heat, the hunger, the strangers pressed against the glass, existed for no functional reason at all beyond the sheer number of families trying to pass through the same narrow gate on the same afternoon. An entirely avoidable ordeal that the culture around Frances had simply decided was an acceptable price for the privilege of being presented, and had never seriously discussed changing. The palace, once Frances finally reached it, offered no real relief. Beneath all of that anticipation and the relief of finally stepping down from the carriage and into the palace itself, most people picture the interior of Buckingham Palace as a cool, spacious refuge. All soaring ceilings and open air, the kind of grand architecture that seems in paintings and photographs. The actual reality, once several hundred fully dressed presentees and their sponsors had been funneled into the palace's staterooms in the long gilded expanse of the picture gallery to await their turn, was closer to a crowded, overheated hall than a cool retreat. Windows in these formal rooms were often kept closed or heavily curtained, both for the dignity of the occasion and for straightforward security. And the sheer number of gas jets and chandeliers required to properly illuminate a room of that scale, burning steadily through a bright June afternoon simply because formal occasions demanded full ceremonial lighting regardless of the hour, threw off a considerable amount of heat into a space already crowded with several hundred human bodies standing shoulder to shoulder in heavy silk, wool, and velvet. There was in the ordinary run of a drawing room no seating provided for presentees waiting their turn, since the entire ceremony was built around standing, walking, and curtsying, rather than sitting, which meant that women already exhausted from hours in a carriage queue then stood, often for another hour or more, packed into a room whose temperature climbed steadily as the afternoon wore on. The predictable result, familiar enough to court officials and etiquette writers of the period that they discussed it with the same weary practicality a modern event organizer might apply to a stretched building's air conditioning, was a recurring pattern of fainting among the young women waiting to be presented. Between the heat, the crowding, the tightly laced corsets, restricting exactly the kind of deep breathing a body under stress most needs, and the sheer nervous strain of the occasion, presentees fainting somewhere in that queue was common enough that most fashionable women carried a small vinaigrette, decorative bottle filled with aromatic smelling salts. Specifically for this purpose, tucked into a reticule alongside a fan and a handkerchief as an entirely ordinary part of a lady's court accessories. What made the situation harder to manage than merely uncomfortable was the palace's own rigid protocol. The guardsmen and footmen stationed throughout the staterooms held ceremonial positions they were required to maintain without interruption, and were not permitted to break rank to assist a fainting guest, regardless of how directly in front of them she collapsed. When a young woman went down in that crowded gallery, it fell entirely to the women standing nearest her, her own mother or sponsor most often. Sometimes a stranger she had exchanged no more than a passing nod with moments before, to catch her, loosen what could be discreetly loosened, wave a vinaigrette beneath her nose, and get her upright and steady again with as little visible disruption to the surrounding ceremony as possible. The rooms themselves worked against every one of these women in ways that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the plain physics of Victorian architecture. Buckingham Palace's grandest interiors, rebuilt and enlarged only decades earlier under Victoria's own direction, were designed above all to impress a visitor's eye. Tall ceilings, long sight lines, walls heavy with gilt and mirrors that multiplied every candle flame and gas jet many times over. And almost no thought at all given to how several hundred warm human bodies, wrapped in wool, velvet, and multiple starched petticoats, might actually be kept comfortable inside them for an entire afternoon. A single lady's fan, the small folding accessory nearly every presentee carried as a matter of course, became, in this context, less an ornament than a genuine, if entirely inadequate, tool of survival, and the steady, synchronized motion of hundreds of fans working at once across the picture gallery that afternoon. By more than one visitor's account of similar drawing rooms in these years, one of the more striking sights of the whole ceremony, a silent, collective acknowledgement of a heat nobody was permitted to complain about directly. Frances did not faint that afternoon, though she came, by her own private estimation afterward, closer to it than she would ever admit to her aunt. Somewhere in the second hour of standing in the picture gallery, the room's heat pressing against her from every side, and the corset making each breath feel shallower than the last, she felt the particular graying at the edges of her vision that she recognized with a distant, almost clinical alarm. As the beginning of the same fainting spell she had just watched overtake a girl perhaps 2 years younger than herself, standing not 10 feet away, who folded gently sideways into her own mother's arms without any warning at all. The whole small crisis absorbed so quickly and so quietly into the surrounding crowd that a guardsman, standing less than 6 feet away, never so much as turned his head. Frances pressed her gloved fingers hard into her own palm, a small, private pain deliberately chosen to counter a larger and more frightening one, and made herself breathe as deeply as the whalebone at her ribs would allow, and the graying at the edges of her vision slowly receded. The broader picture here is a genuinely strange one to sit with. The heat, the crowding, and the fainting were not some unfortunate accident of one unusually warm Jubilee afternoon. They were a predictable, near-annual feature of the drawing room as an institution, well known enough to the court officials who organized it and the ladies who attended it that an entire small industry of vinaigrettes, smelling salts, and quietly discreet revival techniques had grown up specifically to manage it without ever requiring anyone to change the ceremony itself. Liza Picard's Social History of Victorian London describes a city whose grandest interiors were, for all their gilding, frequently among its worst ventilated spaces, built for visual impression rather than for the comfort of the bodies eventually packed inside them, and the picture gallery on a drawing room afternoon was, one specific and well-documented sense, entirely typical of its era rather than any kind of exception to it. There is something quietly instructive in the fact that a fainting girl in that room was not treated as an emergency at all. She was treated as a minor, faintly embarrassing inconvenience, revived as efficiently and as invisibly as possible, so that the actual business of the afternoon, several hundred more curtsies still waiting to be performed in the throne room beyond, could continue exactly on schedule. For Francis, entering into the ranks near the throne room, only one thing remained standing between the last 2 hours of waiting and the end of the ordeal. And it was the single physical task every young woman in that queue had been quietly dreading for months. If you picture a court curtsy at all, you probably picture something close to an ordinary polite bow, a brief, graceful dip of the knees that any well-brought-up young woman could manage without much thought, finished in a second or two, and immediately forgotten. The actual reality was a great deal more demanding than that, and considerably more precisely engineered. The gesture required of every presentee, described in manners and rules of good society, and drilled into girls like Frances for weeks beforehand, was known as the low court curtsy, a deep, controlled sinking of the body nearly to the floor, back held straight the entire way down. Toe, knees, bending outward rather than forward so that the wide skirt and train could settle without crumpling, held for a measured moment at its lowest point, and then risen from again in a single smooth motion without the smallest wobble or grasp for balance. A young woman managed this while wearing a corset that already made deep breathing an effort, a headdress that could not be allowed to tip, and a train that, moments before she reached the throne room itself, an attendant specifically stationed for the purpose would unhook from its carrying loop and spread across the floor behind her, so that the fabric she had carried folded over one arm for the entire afternoon now trailed loose and vulnerable exactly where a careless step could catch it. London's fashionable dancing masters and deportment teachers had, by the 1,880 seconds, built a genuine specialty around exactly this single skill, offering private lessons aimed at nothing beyond producing a flawless low-court curtsy, charging fees that a family further down the social ladder than the Otleys might have found difficult to justify for what amounted to a single afternoon's performance. These instructors taught the mechanics, with an almost military precision, the correct angle of the front foot, the exact distribution of weight across both knees, the specific muscle in the lower back that had to hold firm to prevent the telltale wobble that every observer in that throne room, mothers and rivals alike. Lady Pelham, unable to justify the added expense of a professional instructor on top of everything else the season already demanded, had taken on this particular instruction herself, drawing on her own memory of the identical lessons a dancing master had given her decades earlier, a small act of inherited dodge. Unpaid expertise that saved the Otleys a real sum of money while asking a good deal of patience from both aunt and niece across a month of repeated evening rehearsals. What came after the curtsy to the sovereign was, in the private estimation of most debutantes who left any record of the day, considerably worse than the curtsy itself. Court etiquette absolutely forbade a presentee from turning her back on the monarch at any point during the ceremony, which meant that, having curtsied, Frances then had to walk backward across a considerable stretch of open floor toward the throne room's far doors, and the location of her own trailing train, entirely without looking down or turning her head, using nothing but a memorized count of steps and whatever she could register at the edges of her vision. A page or gentleman usher walked discreetly behind each presentee, specifically to lift the train clear of her feet as she retreated, a small mercy built into the choreography, precisely because the alternative, a young woman treading on her own train while walking blind in reverse, common enough, a disaster that the office had long since made provision against it. Frances had practiced this exact retreat dozens of times in the drawing room at Hartwell Grange, counting paces against a chalk mark her aunt had drawn on the floorboards, walking at first slowly. Then, in the final week, while her aunt deliberately tried to distract her with conversation, 4 precisely, so that the counting would live in her feet, rather than in a mind that might, on the actual day, be too frightened to remember anything at all. For Frances, standing now at the very edge of the throne room, with the doors just ahead of her, and her name about to be read aloud, the weeks of drawing room rehearsal collapsed into a single, almost automatic sequence of movement, her body performing the sinking curtsy. Racing mind could take almost no active credit for. She felt, in the moment itself, less like a young woman being presented to her queen, and more like a mechanism finally being permitted to do the one thing it had been built and rehearsed for months to do. The broader context matters here, because this specific, exacting choreography was never simply about looking pretty in front of the sovereign. It functioned, whether or not anyone at court would have described it so plainly, as an extremely effective filter for exactly the kind of person who was and was not permitted to belong in that room. A merely wealthy family, however much money it could spend on silk and ostrich feathers, could not simply purchase a daughter's ability to sink into a controlled, wobble-free curtsy before retreating blind across an open floor. That skill required weeks of paid instruction from a dancing master or deportment teacher who specialized in exactly this preparation. Instruction that cost real money on top of the gown itself and assumed in turn a family with both the means and the established social knowledge to know that such instruction was necessary at all. Families truly new to society, however rich, could and did stumble here in ways that old, comparatively poor families like the Otleys, who had at least inherited the knowledge of what was required even if they struggled to afford it, generally did not. Etiquette, in this specific and carefully engineered sense, policed the boundaries of English high society at least as effectively as money did, and arguably more effectively, since money could always eventually be earned, while the particular, invisible knowledge of how to walk backward across a palace floor in 3 yards of satin was something that either your family already possessed or did not. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that a gesture so brief, a single curtsy in a short retreat lasting perhaps 30 seconds altogether, had absorbed a full month of Frances's practice, a portion of her family's already strained finances, and the entire nervous focus of her morning, understood to be an entirely reasonable price to pay for 30 seconds performed correctly. And then, after all of it, the moment itself arrived and was gone almost before Frances had time to register that it was happening at all. Most people, imagining the actual instant of being presented to a reigning queen, picture something intimate and conversational, a genuine exchange of words, perhaps a brief question, kindly asked and thoughtfully answered, the kind of personal encounter a young woman might treasure and retell for the rest of her life. The actual reality for the overwhelming majority of the several hundred young women presented at any single drawing room was considerably briefer and very nearly wordless. An officer of the court read Frances's name aloud from a card as she approached, her aunt's name given just before her own as her sponsor, and Frances sank into the low curtsy she had practiced so many hundreds of times at Hartwell Grange, holding it for the measured moment her body now performed almost without her conscious direction. Queen Victoria, by 1887, a woman of 68 who had reigned for half a century and had spent decades of that reign in a private, grieving withdrawal from public life that her golden jubilee had only partially interrupted, stood through the entire long afternoon supported discreetly by senior peeresses of her own household, receiving presentee after presentee in a rhythm that allowed each young woman perhaps a few seconds of the sovereign's actual attention before the next name was already being read. For an untitled gentleman's daughter, such as Frances, the acknowledgement amounted to little more than a slight inclination of the Queen's head. No words exchanged at all. The entire encounter concluded before Frances had even fully risen out of her curtsy. Frances would later struggle when her aunt asked her that same evening what the Queen had actually looked like up close, to produce very much beyond a general impression. A small, solid, black-clad woman, seated with visible fatigue on a raised chair, older and less imposing in the flesh than any official portrait had prepared her to expect. Gone from Frances's direct view again within a handful of seconds. What she remembered with far greater clarity was the counted retreat that followed, the page's hand briefly steadying her train at one especially awkward turn, and the sudden, overwhelming relief of finally reaching the doors and understanding that the single moment her entire season had been built around was now, formally and irreversibly, behind her. The broader picture here is worth sitting with, honestly. An afternoon that had cost the Otley family a portion of their land, 3 months of preparation, and a substantial portion of Frances's own nervous endurance had culminated in an exchange lasting perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, most of it consumed by a curtsy rather than any actual royal notice. Diaries and memoirs from young women presented across these very decades returned to this same anticlimax again and again, describing the disproportion between the build-up and the actual instant with a kind of rueful astonishment that suggests Frances's own reaction was entirely typical rather than any personal failure. The point of the season, it turns out, was never really the 4 seconds in front of the Queen. It was everything that afternoon then permitted a family to claim afterward, in every drawing room, ballroom invitation that followed for the rest of the summer. For Frances, walking back through the crowded ranks of the picture gallery after her presentation, there wasn't even a full hour of relief before the next danger of the afternoon made itself known, and this one had nothing to do with corsets or heat at all. Most people, considering the ordinary human mishaps of a long, exhausting afternoon, a stumble, a dropped bouquet, a curtsy performed a shade too shallow out of pure nerves, assume such things were quietly forgiven, private embarrassments. The actual reality of the London season operated by an entirely different logic. A mistake made in front of the assembled court did not stay contained to the room it happened in. It travelled within hours through a remarkably efficient informal network of mothers, chaperones and ladies' maids, comparing notes in retiring rooms and carriage lines, and within days it had generally reached the drawing rooms, dinner tables, and correspondence of families who had not even been present to witness it firsthand. Etiquette manuals of the period addressed this risk directly and repeatedly, a fact that itself tells you how real and how widely feared the danger actually was. Warning debutantes in language considerably more severe than the manuals used for almost any other subject that a poorly executed presentation. The Society Press added its own layer of exposure. Publications such as the Queen Printing detailed accounts of each drawing room's most notable presentations, occasionally including, in the careful deniable language period, journalism specialized in pointed reference to a young lady who had appeared visibly flustered or had required a moment to recover her composure. Frances heard the mechanism operating in real time before she had even left the palace. Standing in the crowded retiring room where presentees gathered briefly to rearrange trains and gloves before the walk back to their carriages, she overheard 2 older women, mothers of other debutantes presented earlier that same afternoon, discussing in low, unhurried voices a young lady who had stumbled slightly during her retreat from the throne room. Catching her own train and requiring the attending page's hand to steady her, neither woman had witnessed the moment directly. Both of them already had the story in essentially complete detail, including, Frances noted, with a small, cold feeling she did not enjoy, an entirely confident guess at which family the girl belonged to and what it might mean for her prospects that season. The girl who had fainted earlier in the picture gallery, Frances also learned before she reached her own carriage, was already being discussed in similar terms, her collapse recast in the retelling. less as an ordinary consequence of heat and corsetry, and more as a faint suggestion of some underlying delicacy that a prospective mother-in-law might reasonably want to inquire about before allowing her son to take a serious interest. What made this social machinery so effective and so quietly frightening to a young woman standing at the very start of her season was that it required no formal punishment at all to do real damage. Nobody was fined or barred from future events for a poorly executed curtsy. The consequence arrived instead as a kind of quiet, cumulative erosion, a family's invitations to the best houses becoming, over the following weeks, slightly less frequent than they might otherwise have been. A promising young man's mother growing slightly more reserved than her earlier warmth had suggested. Nothing ever stated directly enough to protest or correct, and everything, nonetheless, understood perfectly well by everyone involved. The historian Leonor Davidoff, whose research into the etiquette and social machinery of this exact world remains one of the most thorough accounts of how the season actually policed its own membership, has described this kind of informal, deniable sanction as one of the period's most effective tools for enforcing conformity, precisely because it left no official record for anyone to challenge or appeal. A young woman had, in practice, almost no way to correct her reputation once this quiet machinery had begun working against her. There was no formal hearing to request, no official she might petition, no single conversation that could undo an impression already circulating through a dozen drawing rooms by supper time. The only real remedy available to a family in this position was time, patience, and the hope that a strong enough subsequent performance at the next ball or the next drawing room season might eventually crowd the earlier story out of general circulation. A slow and uncertain process that could easily take longer than the 2 or 3 seasons a young woman typically had before her family began treating her prospects as settled one way or another. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Frances, walking out of Buckingham Palace, having performed her own curtsy in retreat without error, felt something closer to survival than triumph, a recognition that the single physical performance she had just completed correctly, good, had it gone even slightly differently, have quietly reshaped the rest of her season, regardless of anything else true or admirable about her. If the curtsy itself was the performance, the reason an entire family would spend a portion of its land and 3 months of anxious preparation on 30 seconds of it becomes the question worth asking directly, and everyone standing in that palace already knew the answer perfectly well, even if almost nobody said it aloud. Picture the London season, if you picture it at all, as a glittering sequence of balls and garden parties, an extended, enjoyable social whirl which young people met, danced, and occasionally fell in love, with the court presentation serving as a charming ceremonial opening to the fun. The actual reality was closer to a formal marketplace than a romance, and the people running it understood this with a bluntness the surviving record makes difficult to soften. A young woman's presentation at court was, in the plainest possible terms, the moment her family formally announced that she was now available to be courted, a starting gun for a season-long process in which mothers compared notes on eligible young men's incomes and prospects with roughly the same rigor a modern investor might apply to a portfolio, and in which a young woman's own preferences, while not entirely irrelevant, ranked well below her family's assessment of which available match could most improve, almost stabilize, its position. The poet, Lord Byron, writing decades before Frances's own presentation, but describing a system that had changed remarkably little in its fundamentals, had already dismissed the entire institution as a marriage mart. A phrase that stuck precisely because it named something everyone privately understood and almost nobody in polite company would say quite so directly. The historian and biographer Kristen Richardson tracing the long history of the debutante system in both Britain and America, has documented how directly the institution grew out of exactly this economic function. Centuries-old mechanism for sorting eligible young women by family standing and eligible young men by income, dressed by the Victorian period. In the language of romance and royal favor, rather than the language of a marriage market, it very plainly remained a say. The actual negotiations that followed a successful match were often considerably more explicit than the romantic language of the ballroom ever let on. Once a young man's family expressed serious interest, the two sets of parents, or more often the two sets of family solicitors acting on their behalf, would typically exchange detailed information on income, land, debts, and expectations, drawing up what was known as a marriage settlement well before the couple's own engagement was formally announced to society at large, a document specifying exactly what money and property each side brought to the union. A young woman's own dowry, whether in cash, land, or a guaranteed income, was a central term of this negotiation rather than an incidental detail. And a family like the Otleys, thin on ready income, but rich in exactly the kind of old respected name that could not be purchased outright, understood perfectly well that Frances herself was 1. In the plainest financial sense, the asset being offered into that negotiation on her family's behalf. None of this made genuine affection between a married couple impossible, and plenty of season matches did grow into real and lasting attachment. It simply meant that the affection, where it existed, generally arrived after the financial architecture of the marriage had already been settled by other people in other rooms, without much reference to either young person's own feelings on the matter. For Frances, this reality pressed on her with a specific and personal weight that had nothing abstract about it. She understood, in the plain, unsentimental way her father's finances had trained her to understand most things by this point in her life, that the parcel of land sold to fund this season represented a wager her family was making on her own ability to secure a marriage substantial enough to justify the sale. She had, by her own private accounting, perhaps 2 seasons, 3 at the outside, before her family and everyone watching would begin to regard her, quietly but unmistakably, as a season's investment that had failed to pay a return. She loved, more than she had ever confessed to her aunt, the particular freedom of riding alone across her father's remaining fields at Hartwell Grange, an activity her presentation in London was, in its own indirect way, and to eventually help preserve for a family that could no longer entirely afford to keep it without a fortunate marriage. Securing the difference. The broader context here deserves to be stated as plainly as the record allows it to be stated. Marriages among families of Frances's class in 1887 were negotiated, in a great many documented cases, with an explicitness that would strike a modern reader as almost businesslike, terms discussed between fathers and solicitors well before any young couple's own feelings were seriously consulted. Income and land and title weighed against one another in arrangements that historians of the period describe without much romantic softening at all. A wealthy industrial family might actively seek an alliance with an impoverished but titled house precisely for the social standing that money alone could not purchase, while a family like the Otleys, old in name and thin in income, offered exactly the kind of respectable lineage that new money found worth acquiring. Frances herself, whatever she felt riding across her father's fields in whatever private hours remained her own, understood perfectly well which category her family currently occupied in that particular exchange, and had understood it. In the unspoken way, children absorb their family's real position, for a good deal longer than anyone had ever directly explained it to her. There is a specific kind of quiet devastation in recognizing that the young woman who had just performed a nearly flawless curtsy in front of her queen, who had endured a corset, a 6-hour wait, and the constant threat of fainting or stumbling without a single visible complaint, was now expected to spend the following weeks being examined, discussed, and quietly appraised by strangers with roughly the same commercial attention a buyer might bring to inspecting a promising piece of land, and that everyone in her own family, out of love rather than cruelty, considered this appraisal the entire point of everything she had just endured. If the curtsy was invisible, labor performed under close observation, what came after Frances finally climbed back into the family's hired carriage that evening was its own kind of invisible endurance, quietly demanded, and just as quietly hidden from view. Picture the end of a long, triumphant social occasion, and you probably picture relief arriving quickly and pleasantly. A satisfied young woman shedding her finery with a light heart, perhaps a celebratory supper, a proud embrace from her family, the whole day settling comfortably into a happy memory before bed. The actual homecoming, for a young woman who had spent the better part of 10 hours laced, pinned, and upright, was considerably less comfortable than that picture suggests. Sarah began the slow work of unpinning Frances's hair almost the moment they reached Chester Street, drawing out, one by one, the dozens of pins that had anchored the false hair pads, the veil, and the 3 ostrich feathers since 8:30 that morning, a process that took the better part of half an hour and left Frances's scalp tender. In 2 or 3 places where a pin had been driven in slightly too close to the skin, faintly bleeding. The corset came off next, and with it came the visible record of the entire day, a set of deep pink lines pressed into Frances's ribs and waist, exactly where the busk and boning had sat, some of them, at the tightest points, already darkening toward the beginnings of a bruise. Her feet, laced into new kid boots, bought specifically for the occasion, and never properly broken in beforehand, had raised a blister at each heel from the hours of standing and the careful measured walking the curtsy and retreat had required, an injury she had not even noticed accumulating during the day itself. So thoroughly had her attention been consumed by everything else demanded of her. Sarah worked through all of it with the same brisk, practiced competence she brought to every other part of her duties, dabbing a little arnica ointment onto the worst of the corset marks and wrapping a strip of soft linen around each blistered heel without comment. The whole small ritual of repair as invisible to the rest of the household as the earlier ritual of construction had been that same morning. It occurred to Frances, watching Sarah's hands move with quiet efficiency in the lamplight, that her maid had almost certainly performed this exact sequence of small repairs for other young women before her. Other presentation days, other bruised ribs and blistered heels, tended to in other quiet bedrooms, and that Sarah herself would likely never be asked by anyone in the family she served what she actually thought of a season that spent so much money and so much of her own labor, producing a single afternoon's controlled performance of effortlessness. Physicians of the period occasionally noted, in passing rather than as any grave medical concern, a recognizable pattern of exhaustion and minor collapse among young women in the days immediately following a court presentation, a combination of prolonged fasting, tight lacing, standing, and acute nervous strain that left more than a few debutantes truly unwell for a day or two afterward, requiring nothing more dramatic than rest, food, and a loosened stay, but requiring it all the same. Nobody in Frances's family used a word stronger than tired to describe what she was clearly feeling by the time Sarah finally helped her into a dressing gown that evening, though tired barely began to cover the particular full-body heaviness that had settled into her by then, equal parts hunger, relief, a lingering ache in muscles she had not known. Until that day, she was capable of straining quite this way. For Frances herself, the private minute after Sarah left the room, the corset finally off, the pins finally out. A plate of bread and cold meat finally in front of her, after nearly 12 hours without a proper meal, held an emotional weight she had not expected and did not entirely welcome. She found herself, quite without meaning to, crying quietly over the plate, not from any single specific unhappiness, but from the sheer delayed release of a fear she had been holding rigidly in check since Sarah first began dressing her hair that morning, and she was careful, even in that private moment, to wipe her face clean before her aunt might think to check on her, because the performance of composure she had already learned did not entirely end simply because the audience had gone home. The broader reckoning waiting for the Otley family the following morning was a financial one, and Colonel Otley conducted it, as he conducted most difficult subjects, with his study door closed. A family attempting a London season on truly frugal terms could expect to spend something in the neighbourhood of £900 across the full summer once lodging, gowns, gloves, carriage hire, and the presentation fee itself were all totaled together, a sum that climbed steeply into the thousands. For families determined to entertain lavishly or dress their daughters in a style calculated to impress. The historian Leonor Davidoff's research into the season's actual accounts and correspondence shows families across this entire financial range treating the expense with the same grim, deliberate seriousness a modern family might apply to a mortgage, a debt taken on in the explicit hope of a specific, calculable return. Colonel Otley had sold his outlying parcel of land for considerably less than the full cost of Francis's season, which meant the remainder had been quietly borrowed against the estate's already thin credit, a fact Francis would not learn in precise figures for some years yet, though she understood, sitting with her cold supper that first night, that whatever had just happened to her body had also happened in its own way to her family's finances, and that both accounts were now expected to show a return. There is something worth naming plainly in the fact that Francis's entire visible triumph that day, the flawless curtsy, the composed retreat, the approving nod from her aunt, rested directly on top of an evening of bleeding pinpricks, bruised ribs, blistered feet, and quiet tears eaten alone over a cold supper. None of which anyone beyond Sarah and Francis herself would ever have reason to know about. The season, having taken its first full day's payment from her body, would expect her dressed and composed again within the week for the next ball on a calendar that had no particular interest in how long her bruises took to heal. Which brings us to a question that Francis herself was only beginning to understand that same week, standing in a crowded ballroom 2 nights later and recognizing, across the room, the unmistakable stiff posture of another young woman, clearly nursing the same fresh bruises under her own bodice. Most people picture the young women of a London season as rivals first, and friends only incidentally, a crowd of carefully composed competitors eyeing one another across every ballroom with polite, watchful suspicion and very little real warmth. The actual reality, as it emerged for Francis over the following weeks, was considerably more layered than pure rivalry, because the ordeal she had just survived was, in the most literal physical sense, a shared one. Every young woman presented that Jubilee summer had endured some version of the identical corset, the identical hours of standing, the identical fear of a mistimed curtsy, and the particular, immediate recognition that passed between 2 debutantes who had both just lived through it produced a genuine, if complicated, camaraderie. Alongside the competition the season also, unavoidably, demanded of them. Francis had met a young woman named Georgiana Fitzwalter at a curtsy rehearsal weeks earlier, the daughter of a prosperous Manchester cotton family with considerably deeper pockets than the Otleys and considerably less inherited social standing to draw on. And the two of them had struck up, almost by accident, the kind of fast, practical friendship two people form when they are frightened of the same specific thing at the same specific time. At the drawing room itself, It had been Georgiana who quietly passed Frances a small vinaigrette of her own in the crowded picture gallery. When she noticed Frances's color fading, a kindness offered without comment or acknowledgement, beyond a brief, understanding look, steered a mutual acquaintance's overly loud conversation about a stumbling debutante away from Georgiana's own family, sensing correctly that the story was already circling uncomfortably close to home. And yet neither young woman was under any illusion about what the rest of the season actually required of them. Georgiana's family's considerable fortune made her, in the plain arithmetic of the marriage market, a highly appealing prospect to families with old names and thin finances, not unlike the Otleys. And Frances understood perfectly well that she and her new friend were, in any drawing room containing the same eligible young men, quietly competing with one another, whether either of them wished to frame it that way or not. The two things, the real affection and the real rivalry, sat beside each other without much apparent contradiction, because both were simply true at once and both were simply part of what the season demanded. The broader picture here stretches well beyond Frances's own particular summer, because the institution she and Georgiana were both navigating proved remarkably durable. Formal court presentations of young women continued in almost exactly this shape for another 7 decades after the Golden Jubilee season, surviving 2 world wars and enormous social change, before Queen Elizabeth II finally abolished the practice in 1958, reportedly after Prince Philip himself dismissed the entire tradition with characteristic bluntness as bloody daft. The final group of debutantes, some 1,400 young women, was presented that same year, closing out a ritual that had shaped the entrance of English aristocratic and upper-middle-class young women to adult society. The specific mechanism of court presentation ended there, but the underlying social function always served, sorting eligible young women by family standing and quietly announcing their availability to eligible young men, migrated with barely a pause into new forms. In smaller and more voluntary versions into the present day. There is something clarifying in recognizing that Frances's own particular afternoon, however singular and frightening it felt to her personally, was one instance of a machine built to run for centuries, largely unchanged, refined only at its edges, and that the genuine friendship she formed with Georgiana Fitzwalter under exactly that machine's pressure was, in its own small way, evidence that the young women passing through it never stopped finding ways to be human to one another, even while the system around them insisted on treating them as competitors first. There is a particular, quieter kind of endurance test that never appeared anywhere in Frances's own afternoon at all, and it belonged to every family in London who wanted exactly what the Otleys had and simply could not reach it. If you assume that a court presentation was, at bottom, available to any respectable young woman whose family scraped together enough money for a good dress, the actual machinery of the system was built to prevent exactly that assumption from ever becoming true. The requirement of sponsorship sat at the center of the exclusion. A debutante needed a lady already presented at court to vouch for her, and that single requirement quietly filtered out an enormous number of families who might otherwise have managed the expense of a gown and a carriage, but had no personal connection whatsoever to anyone who had ever stood in that throne room herself. A prosperous shopkeeper's daughter, no matter how well raised or how truly accomplished, simply had no root into the system at all, because nobody in her family's actual circle of acquaintance could offer the one thing money could not buy directly, a sponsor's name already known and trusted by the Lord Chamberlain's own office. The Otleys, for all their diminished finances, possessed exactly this asset in Lady Pelham, an inherited social credential, considerably rarer and more valuable in the specific currency of the London season than ready cash. Families with new industrial fortunes, men who had built genuine wealth in cotton, coal, or shipping over the preceding 30 years, often spent years cultivating precisely the kind of social relationship that might eventually produce a willing sponsor for a daughter, a slow, deliberate campaign of calling cards, and carefully attended church services aimed at nothing more concrete than being known well enough, eventually, by somebody who could open that single door. Colonial wealth complicated the picture further, and did so in ways that touched Francis's own family directly. Colonel Otley's years in India had connected the Otleys, if only loosely, to a whole world of officers, merchants, and colonial administrators whose own daughters, raised largely outside England and sometimes never having set foot in the country before their own season, still expected and often received the same court presentation as any London-born debutante, provided their family could produce a proper sponsor and afford the London house, even if only briefly rented, that the season required. A colonial fortune, freshly made in indigo, tea, or trade, could in this way sometimes purchase its way into precisely the same throne room as an old, thin-blooded English family like the Otleys, provided it had also secured the one asset that mattered more than money. And this uneasy mixing of old lineage and new colonial wealth was, by 1887, a familiar feature of the season that etiquette writers occasionally addressed with visible discomfort, plainly uncertain how to rank a fortune made abroad against a title held at home for 3 centuries. Beneath every family that did manage to secure a presentation, meanwhile, sat a much larger number that never came close, respectable middle-class households, who held their own smaller assemblies, county balls, and local subscription dances instead. An entirely real, and often quite pleasant social world that operated by its own rules and produced its own marriages, but that carried none of the specific prestige and none of the specific pressure. Judith Flanders, in her extensive social histories of Victorian domestic and social life, has described this layered structure of Victorian society with real precision, a hierarchy in which the London season and its court presentation sat at the very narrow top of a much broader pyramid of overlapping, class-specific social worlds, each one operating its own version of the identical marriage market logic at a lower altitude and a lower cost. Frances herself gave this exclusion almost no direct thought on the day of her own presentation, absorbed as she was in her own private ordeal, but she understood it well enough in the abstract, having grown up watching her own family's steadily diminishing income sit, uncomfortably but securely, on the correct side of a line that plenty of equally deserving families never crossed at all. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the entire punishing machinery this video has spent so long describing, the corset, the fainting, the merciless curtsy, was not a burden shared equally across English society but a specific, exhausting privilege, available only to families who had already cleared an earlier and in some ways more decisive filter, the simple, unbuyable question of who a family happened to know. And at the very center of that entire exhausting machinery, presiding over every single one of those brief, wordless curtsies for hour after hour, stood a woman whose own body was quietly enduring a version of the identical ordeal, though almost nobody watching her that afternoon thought to consider it in quite those terms. Most people picture Queen Victoria receiving her Golden Jubilee debutantes as an act of pure, effortless authority, a monarch simply standing by right and by habit at the summit of a ceremony built entirely around her. The actual physical reality of Victoria's own afternoon deserves a closer look than the popular image usually gives it. By the summer of 1887, Victoria was 68 years old, a woman who had spent the 26 years since her husband Albert's death largely withdrawn from public ceremony, appearing so rarely and so reluctantly in the earlier decades of her widowhood. Scene was still fulfilling her basic public duty. Golden Jubilee had drawn her back into precisely the kind of sustained public performance she had spent a generation avoiding, and the drawing rooms of that particular summer expanded in number specifically to accommodate the unusual demand of the Jubilee season. Asked her to stand for hour after hour, receiving an unbroken procession of curtsying young women, supported, contemporary accounts describe, by senior peeresses of her own household, positioned discreetly close enough to catch her if her own considerable stamina finally gave out. Victoria had first taken up this exact duty as a young queen barely out of her teens, presiding over her earliest drawing rooms within months of her own coronation, at an age not far removed from Francis's own, and had continued the ritual, with only the interruptions her own grief and ill health occasionally forced upon her. Across the full arc of a reign that had by 1887 already outlasted the memory of most of the debutantes filing past her that afternoon. She had worn simple black, the same widow's dress she had adopted after Albert's death, and rarely abandoned since, even at the height of a Jubilee summer built specifically to celebrate her. A visible reminder to everyone in that throne room that the woman receiving their curtsies carried her own private history of loss directly into the middle of the ceremony's public glamour. Court physicians of the period, tasked with monitoring the aging queen's stamina at exactly these kinds of prolonged public engagements, are known to have counseled shorter sessions and more frequent rest, wherever the calendar allowed it. Advice the demands of a Jubilee season did not always leave much room to follow. There is a particular kind of clarity in recognizing that Francis, curtsying nervously before a woman she had spent all afternoon regarding as the single most powerful figure in her world, was in that exact moment facing another woman who had spent 5 decades performing an almost identical endurance, rather better than anyone else in that room could have, precisely what the young woman in front of her was managing to hold together. Victoria's own comfort was, by every account, a distant secondary concern to the ceremony's continued smooth operation, in precisely the same way Francis's own comfort had been a distant secondary concern to her family's ambitions that same afternoon. The Queen could not sit through the procession any more than the debutantes filing past her could not eat or drink or step away for more than the briefest possible pause, and did all of this in her own version of restrictive, weighty, formal dress. At an age when a full afternoon of continuous standing represented a considerably more serious physical demand than it had during the vigorous early years of her reign, when she had first begun presiding over drawing rooms as a young, newly married queen. There is something worth sitting with one more time in the fact that the entire elaborate structure of endurance this video has spent so long describing did not stop at the debutantes themselves, but extended all the way to the top of it, to a 68-year-old widow standing for hours, still worn even at the height of her own Jubilee celebrations, presiding over a ritual that asked a version of the same uncomplaining physical performance from every woman it touched, regardless of how much power any individual woman in that room actually held. Victoria was in her own way as trapped inside a ceremony's demands, any debutante curtsying in front of her, and the culture surrounding both of them had agreed, with the same quiet, comprehensive silence it applied to every other detail this video has described. 10 days after her presentation, once the worst of the bruising along her ribs had faded enough to be comfortably laced over again, Frances sat for the formal portrait her aunt had arranged from the very beginning of the season's planning, and the sitting turned out to be its own small, revealing echo of everything that had come before it. Picture a Victorian court portrait, painted or photographed, and you likely assume it simply recorded whatever a young woman actually looked like on the day in question, a faithful, more or less spontaneous capture of a real afternoon. The actual practice of court portraiture in 1887 involved a great deal more careful construction than that assumption allows. Photography, Still a relatively young art compared to painting, but increasingly the preferred choice among fashionable families for exactly this kind of commemorative image, required subjects to hold a chosen pose without moving for several seconds at a time. Though considerably faster than photography's earliest decades, still punished the smallest twitch or blink with a blurred and unusable plate. The photographer James Lafayette, whose Dublin studio had already begun attracting exactly this kind of fashionable commission, having photographed the Princess of Wales 2 years earlier and photographing Queen Victoria herself at Windsor that same Jubilee year, represented the leading edge of a trade rapidly displacing painted portraiture as the preferred way for a family to preserve a daughter's presentation for the family album, and not infrequently for reproduction in the Illustrated Society press. The studio backdrop for such a sitting was typically a painted canvas suggesting a grand interior, marble columns or a heavy velvet drape rendered in convincing perspective, allowing a family who could not actually arrange a sitting inside Buckingham Palace itself to produce an image that suggested precisely that setting, a small, universally accepted fiction that nobody examining the finished photograph felt any need to point out. Frances's own sitting, arranged at a respected studio not far from her aunt's house, took the better part of an hour to produce the single image her aunt eventually chose for the family album, the photographer repositioning her train twice, adjusting the angle of her chin 3 separate times, to hold an entirely motionless, faintly serene expression for a slow count of several seconds, while the plate exposed a smaller, more contained version of the same discipline the original curtsy had demanded of her. Her feet, still faintly tender from the blisters raised at the palace, ached quietly inside a fresh pair of shoes the entire time, an ache the finished photograph naturally would never show anyone who looked at it. The resulting portrait, framed and sent to relatives as far away as an aunt still living near Colonel Otley's old regiment in India, showed precisely what every such portrait was built: to show a composed, flawlessly dressed young woman standing before what appeared to be a grand palace interior, her expression serene, her train arranged in an elegant sweep that had, in reality, required a photographer's assistant kneeling just out of frame to hold it in place. The broader context here connects directly back to nearly everything this video has already described, because the same culture that asked Frances to perform composure through 6 hours of heat, hunger, and physical strain, then commissioned a separate smaller performance of composure specifically to create the lasting record future generations would actually see. Museum collections and private family archives across Britain today hold thousands of these court presentation portraits, painted and photographed alike, and nearly every one of them shows the identical serene, effortless surface this video has spent so long working underneath. Because that surface was the entire point of commissioning the image in the first place. A modern viewer encountering one of these portraits in an archive or an old family album, exactly as you might have encountered one before pressing play on this video, has almost no way of independently knowing about the corset marks, the blistered feet, or the 6-hour carriage queue sitting just outside the frame, because the portrait was built with real skill and real intention to make certain no one ever would. There is something worth sitting with in this specific and rather quiet way, in the fact that Frances's own portrait now hangs more than a century on, in a descendant's home, as a treasured memento of a single glamorous afternoon, admired for exactly the qualities this video has spent so long complicating. The effortless-looking beauty, and that the portrait itself, for all its careful construction, is not therefore a lie so much as an incomplete truth. A single frozen second, standing in for 6 hours, that the frame was never built to hold. Which brings us to the question nobody a crowded picture gallery asked aloud, but every single woman standing in it was quietly, privately managing all afternoon long. If you have followed Frances through the carriage queue and the hours of standing, you have probably already begun wondering, in the plain, unglamorous way this video has encouraged from its very first minute, what a young woman in full court dress actually did if she needed to relieve herself, or if her monthly courses happened to fall, as they occasionally must have, for at least some fraction of the hundreds of young women presented at any given drawing room on this specific and entirely inconvenient afternoon. The actual mechanics of Victorian women's underclothes make the first part of that question considerably stranger than most people expect. Victorian drawers, unlike modern undergarments, were typically constructed with an open, unsewn seam at the crotch, specifically that a fully dressed woman could use a chamber pot or a discreet outdoor convenience without the lengthy process of removing several layers of petticoat, corset cover, and gown. A sensible design choice that living history researchers such as Ruth Goodman have documented and explained in careful detail. What? That design solved the basic anatomical problem for an ordinary day at home, where a chamber pot or a water closet sat within easy private reach, and a woman had a maid on hand to help manage her skirts. It did almost nothing to solve the problem Frances actually faced inside Buckingham Palace, where several hundred women in full court dress were funneled through a sequence of grand public rooms with no private facilities provided for their use at any point in the ceremony. Would have required Frances to somehow manage a 3-yard train, a wired bustle, and a headdress that could not be allowed to tip, entirely without the maid who had spent 2 hours penning her into all of it that morning. In practice, the vast majority of presentees simply did not eat, drink, or attend to any bodily need for the entire duration of the outing. A fact every etiquette manual and every family preparing a daughter for presentation understood well enough to plan around directly, advising a very light breakfast and a firm expectation that the whole ordeal would be endured on an essentially empty body until it was finally completely over. For a young woman whose monthly courses happened to arrive on precisely the wrong afternoon, the situation demanded an additional, entirely private layer of quiet management. Menstruating women of this period typically relied on washable cloth pads, sometimes homemade and sometimes purchased ready-made from a chemist, secured by a belt or pinned directly to the drawers. A method requiring periodic changing, but a full day in court dress made every bit as impractical as visiting any other kind of convenience. A debutante managing her courses on presentation day had no real option beyond securing the cloth as reliably as she could that morning, and simply enduring whatever discomfort and anxiety followed for the remaining hours, an added, invisible burden layered on top of the corset. And the fear of fainting that this video has already described at length, and one that the culture around her had no vocabulary to acknowledge even in private conversation between a mother and a daughter, let alone in any etiquette manual printed for general circulation. Frances herself was spared this particular complication on the day of her own presentation, a fact she registered afterward with a private specific relief she did not examine too closely at the time. She had discussed the general anxiety of the timing with Georgiana Fitzwalter during one of their curtsy rehearsals, both of them aware. In the quiet, matter-of-fact way young women of their age and position learn to be aware of such things. That half the debutantes filing through the throne room that summer were managing some version of exactly this private arithmetic underneath their identical white satin, and that not one word of it would ever appear in any account of the season's most celebrated afternoons. Broader context matters here, because it says something specific about which parts of a woman's body Victorian culture was prepared to discuss, and which parts it was not. The same society that could describe in exhaustive technical detail the precise regulation length of a court train or the correct angle of an ostrich feather had almost no public language at all for menstruation, treating it as a subject fit only for private conversation between women, medical texts written for physicians rather than patients, and advertisements for sanitary products that spoke entirely in euphemism. The social historian Judith Flanders has traced this particular silence through Victorian domestic manuals and correspondence, noting how thoroughly subject affecting roughly half the population on a monthly basis was excluded from any respectable public discussion, even as the same culture demanded that women, one, visibly and without complaint, in settings as demanding and as thoroughly documented as a royal drawing room. There is something clarifying, in the end, about naming this specific silence plainly. Every young woman in that crowded gallery, whatever her own particular circumstances that afternoon, was managing a body with entirely ordinary needs inside a ceremony that had made no provision whatsoever for those needs, and had built, instead, an elaborate and largely successful cultural agreement never to mention the gap between the two out loud. Step back now from the corset laces and the carriage wheels and the counted backward steps, and a handful of larger patterns start to emerge from everything Francis's single afternoon has shown us. Patterns that reach well beyond one dressing room on Chester Street and say something considerably larger about the world that built this particular ritual. The first pattern is the simplest to name and the hardest to fully absorb, which is that the performance of effortlessness this video opened with. The composed young woman standing so still in front of her mirror required an almost unbelievable quantity of hidden physical labor to produce and sustain. Every element of that opening image depended on work nobody in the room was meant to notice. Sarah's 2 hours of pinning, the dressmaker's weeks of fitting, the dancing master's paid instruction in a curtsy most people assume any well-bred girl could simply perform on instinct. The photographer's careful staging of a portrait, built to erase every trace of the blistered feet standing just outside the frame. None of this labor was hidden by accident. It was hidden by design, because the entire cultural value of the performance depended on it looking like no labor had gone into it at all. A fashionable young woman simply being naturally graceful, rather than a young woman executing, under real physical duress, a role she had spent months rehearsing. Francis's own body, laced and pinned and drilled for a single afternoon, was in this specific sense a kind of machine built to look like it was not a machine, and the entire apparatus of the season depended on nobody looking too closely at the gears. That particular sleight of hand, effort dressed up as effortlessness, is worth naming because it did not stay confined to 1887 or to court presentations or even to women alone, and a modern viewer watching this same video might reasonably recognize a version of it in their own life without needing much help to see the resemblance. Any performance a culture agrees to admire as natural, whether it is a debutante's curtsy, a fashionable complexion, or some other display entirely, tends to conceal a very similar quantity of unglamorous labor underneath it, labor that stays invisible for exactly as long as everyone involved keeps quietly agreeing not to mention it. The second pattern concerns exactly what the culture around Francis was and was not willing to discuss out loud, and the line it drew turns out to be considerably stranger than a modern observer might expect. Victorian society could describe in exhaustive and perfectly respectable public detail the precise regulation length of a court train, the correct arrangement of 3 ostrich feathers, the exact financial cost of a proper London season. It had almost no vocabulary at all in any setting a young woman like Francis would have been permitted to hear, for menstruation, for the specific physical sensation of a corset restricting her breath, or for the reality that women fainted at these ceremonies with enough regularity that a small industry of vinaigrettes had grown up specifically to manage it without comment. The body, in other words, was simultaneously the entire subject of the ritual, the thing being dressed, displayed, and evaluated for its marriage prospects, and the one subject the ritual's own language refused to address honestly. Everything about Frances's day was organized around her physical body, and almost nothing about that same day permitted anyone to speak plainly about what her physical body was actually experiencing. The third pattern is the one Frances herself understood most clearly. In the specific, unsentimental way her family's finances had trained her to understand it, and it concerns how thoroughly etiquette itself functioned as an economic filter, every bit as powerful as money. Her fortune alone could buy silk, feathers, and a fashionable address for the season, but it could not buy the specific, deeply practiced physical skill of a flawless court curtsy or the inherited social connection required to secure a sponsor in the first place, in ways that favored families who already possessed the knowledge that such preparation was even necessary. The Ottleys, old in name and increasingly thin in income, held exactly this kind of inherited knowledge in reserve, even as their actual finances weakened year by year. While families with genuine new wealth, no matter how considerable, often had to spend years simply learning which doors existed before they could begin trying to open them. Money mattered enormously in this world. It was never, on its own, sufficient. The fourth pattern is perhaps the one most worth sitting with before we return, finally, to Frances herself, because it concerns the specific kind of strength this entire ritual actually demanded, as opposed to the kind of fragility the era's own portraits and paintings preferred to suggest. The popular image of a Victorian young lady leans heavily on delicacy, a swooning, breakable creature who required careful handling and constant protection. The actual young women filing through Buckingham Palace that Jubilee summer, Frances and Georgiana Fitzwalter among them, endured a 6-hour carriage queue, a corset restricting their own breath, a room heated well past comfort by hundreds of gas jets, and the very real prospect of collapsing in front of the entire assembled court. And the overwhelming majority of them, fainting spells and all, got back up, finished the ceremony, and did it again at the next ball a few days later. Even Queen Victoria herself, at 68 years old, and only reluctantly returned to public life after decades of private mourning, stood through hour after hour of exactly the same physical demand rather than being permitted to sit it out. Whatever this ritual actually reveals about the women who performed it, fragility is not really the word for it. Endurance is closer, and endurance, unlike fragility, is not a quality anyone typically finds beautiful enough to paint. Frances's own particular afternoon sits at the intersection of all four of these patterns at once. A young woman whose visible effortlessness depended on invisible labor, whose most ordinary physical needs went entirely unacknowledged by the ceremony organized around her body, whose family's inherited social knowledge mattered as much as its shrinking bank balance, and whose quiet, unglamorous endurance, not her fragility, was the actual quality that got her through the day. None of this made her afternoon at Buckingham Palace any less deeply important to her, or to her family's future, or to the version of English high society that had built this entire elaborate ritual over centuries and would go on building it, largely unchanged, for another 7 decades after her own presentation. It simply means that the version of the afternoon Frances's own descendants would eventually frame and hang on a drawing room wall was never quite the whole story. And it is worth knowing clearly, and without judgment, exactly what that framed portrait leaves out. Picture her once more, then, exactly as we found her. Frances Ottley, 18 years old, standing in the middle of a borrowed dressing room on Chester Street, the early afternoon light catching the white duchesse satin of her skirt and turning it the pale, faintly luminous color of the inside of a shell. The 3 ostrich feathers still rise from the crown of her head, arranged in their careful fan. The veil still falls to her shoulders. Her aunt still stands a few feet away, satisfied, adjusting the angle of a single feather by half an inch before stepping back to admire the whole finished picture. Nothing about the image itself has changed. What has changed is everything we now understand about what stands underneath it. You are looking at a young woman whose scalp will be tender for days from the dozens of hairpins already driven into it, whose corset, laced 2 inches tighter than she wears at home, is already pressing a set of marks into her ribs that will not fully fade for a week, and who will not eat or drink again for close to 12 hours. Having chosen a light breakfast that morning specifically because her body would soon be sealed inside a garment that made any ordinary human need close to impossible to attend to. You are looking at a young woman who has spent a full month learning to walk backward across a drawing room floor with a curtain pinned to her shoulders, counting her own steps by feel, because she will shortly have to perform that exact walk again, blind, in front of the one woman in England whose brief attention could shake the rest of her life. You are looking at a family that sold a parcel of its own land to pay for the satin she is wearing, a father who conducted the full financial reckoning behind a closed study door, and an aunt whose own presentation 26 years earlier taught her exactly how much this single afternoon was going to cost her niece, in ways a bank ledger could never fully capture. You are looking too at a young woman who will stand for hours in a crowded, overheated gallery, lit by hundreds of gas jets, who will watch another girl faint quietly into her own mother's arms, not 10 feet away, and understand with real clarity how close she herself is standing to the same edge, and who will press her own gloved fingers hard into her palm rather than let her knees give way in front of a room that has no formal provision at all for catching her if they do. She will curtsy nearly to the floor without a single visible tremor. She will walk backward across an open expanse of palace flooring without once turning away from her queen, guided by nothing more than a memorized count of steps and a page's discreet hand, steadying her train. The whole encounter with the sovereign herself will last perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, most of them spent sinking into a curtsy rather than receiving any actual royal notice, and she will spend the rest of the evening, once she is finally privately unlaced, crying quietly over a cold supper for reasons she will not fully be able to name even to herself. None of this will show in the portrait her family eventually chooses for the album, the one a photographer will spend the better part of an hour arranging some 10 days later, adjusting her train, her chin, the angle of her whole composed body, until the image matches exactly what everyone has already agreed a triumphant young debutante is supposed to look like. That portrait will travel to relatives as far away as India. It will hang eventually in a descendant's home more than a century from now, admired for a poise and an effortlessness that this video has spent its entire length quietly, patiently taking apart. She's not a fool for the fact that almost none of this shows. She is exactly as informed, exactly as prepared, and exactly as composed as an entire culture spent 18 years training her to be. And the composure itself, seen clearly, is not a mask laid over an absence of real strength. It is the strength. Frances is resilient in the specific, unglamorous way most real endurance actually looks, which is to say she simply keeps standing, keeps counting her steps, keeps her face arranged correctly, and does not entirely understand, until years afterward, how much her own body carried that single afternoon without ever once being asked whether it was willing. And she looks magnificent, standing there in front of that mirror, not because the ache in her ribs and the fear behind her steady eyes have been erased from the picture, because they are sitting quietly and entirely unremarked, right in the middle of it, folded into the same satin and feathers everyone in the room has agreed to call effortless. The carriage is waiting outside now, and in a moment Sarah will settle the last fold of the train over Francis's arm, and her aunt will give one final satisfied nod, and the two of them will walk down together to begin an afternoon that will ask more of Francis's body than almost anything else her 18 years have yet required of it. She does not know, standing in this dressing room, exactly how the day will end, whether she will falter or hold, whether the fainting will find her to or pass her by, whether the gossip that finds its way through every London drawing room by nightfall will be kind to her or otherwise. She knows only that the carriage is here, that her feathers are pinned exactly as the Queen prefers to see them, and that whatever this particular afternoon asks of her, she intends to give it quietly and without a single visible tremor. The light through the tall window catches her one last time before she turns toward the door, the white satin glowing faintly against the June afternoon. And then she is gone from the mirror's frame, down the stairs, and out into the waiting carriage, carrying the whole weight of it, silk and steel and expectation together. Exactly the way she has been taught to carry everything else. Somewhere behind her, in the quiet dressing room she has just left, the mirror keeps its own steady, empty reflection of the window and the June light and nothing else at all, holding no memory of the young woman who stood in front of it a moment ago, learning one final time to look exactly as effortless as everyone downstairs already believes her to be. The house settles back into its ordinary afternoon quiet, and somewhere below, a carriage door closes softly on Chester Street.